If you are like me, you have been asking yourself over and over again why on earth people are effectively celebrating Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists in Western cities across the world. To the literal-minded, and others who do not yet recognize the character of the pathologies emanating from identity politics, it may seem head-scratching, for instance, to see LGBTQ plus organizations cheering on a Hamas victory, irrespective of how Hamas actually deals with folks in the LGBTQ plus community. Many in the climate change movement, which presumably has nothing to do with Israel or the Palestinians, have also openly expressed their desires to, quote, crush Zionism. Indeed, those were the words of climate activist Greta Thunberg, and the exclusion of the deaths and suffering of Jewish women demonstrated by so-called feminist causes has also been well documented during the last 6 months. All of these instances are known as progressive extremism, which many people, including many Jews, are unfamiliar with. Instead, Jewish history has largely been ripe with regressive extremism. It gains popularity by promising to uplift weaker members of society, often using social welfare programs and/or religion to establish trust and mobilize the masses. Once in power, regressive extremists impose tyrannical and authoritarian rule and violently quell dissent. Modern-day regressive extremist regimes include Iran, Qatar, and Russia. Then there is progressive extremism, which gains popularity by promising to uplift weaker members of society and uses extremely socialist rhetoric and identity politics to gain trust and mobilize the masses. This type of extremism thrives in quasi-liberal environments, such as on university campuses and in certain aspects of the media. What is most disturbing, however, is that it has gained steam in mainstream Western institutions like government, education, pop culture, and NGOs. South Africa is probably the best example of a modern-day progressive extremist regime, and governments in the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Spain, France, Sweden, and the US are on the brink of becoming progressive extremists. Obviously, progressive extremism and regressive extremism are both dangerous in and of themselves, but their convergence is even more worrisome. And that is precisely what has been happening over the last few decades, only to be amplified by the October 7th Hamas-led massacres that preempted this Israel-Hamas war. This convergence is known as the Red-Green Alliance, a marriage between progressive and regressive extremists. Hence the systemic exclusion of Jews from progressive spaces, even as Jews have historically supported just about every social reform movement on this planet. The Red-Green Alliance is also severely impacting the Western world's foreign policy by paralyzing its support for the Jewish state, Israel, while minimizing criticism of extremist anti-Western governments like the Islamic Republic of Iran and Qatar. Ukraine, a Western ally, gets invaded by Russia, and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced last week that, quote, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Israel, also a Western ally that likely does more for the West than Ukraine, gets invaded by Hamas, and Blinken says that the Jewish state is on the verge of becoming, quote, indistinguishable from the terror group that was responsible for murdering in cold blood 1,200 people on October 7th, wounding thousands more, raping dozens of women, both dead and alive, burning whole families to death, and kidnapping 250 people, including children, women, and the elderly. At the same time, there has minimal mention by the West of Iran's involvement in October 7th and thereafter, including with its proxies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Yemen, the Houthis, which have become additional fronts against Israel. An ultra-conservative political group in Iran recently said that slain Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander Mohammad Reza Zahedi was involved in the planning and execution of the October 7th Hamas-led massacres in Israel. Hence, why the IDF just assassinated him in an Iranian consulate building in Syria, and why it is so obvious that Iran and even Qatar were significantly involved in October 7th, despite so many Western politicians trying to lie to us that they were not. Being weak towards your enemies, Iran, and harsh towards your allies, Israel, is a strategy that has never proven itself, wrote Amy Hai Chick Lee, an Israeli minister. Perhaps most perturbing about the Red-Green alliance is that Islamic extremists are jumping into bed with progressive ones. While progressives might just be naive, ignorant, or just plain stupid, Islamic extremists are very measured in their aim to dismantle democracy and democratic values across the world. As one Muslim said, "When I was an extremist Islamist fundamentalist, I would only vote left. Why is that? I saw them as very stupid. I would fear the conservatives because they come with principle. That's not someone they can brainwash, but the left, I know they have no values and no principles to begin with. I dare you to find one Islamic extremist that votes for Donald Trump. They give their vote to the leftist who wants to run around in pride parades. Islamic extremists are against gays and homosexuals and transgenders, but they want the left to go and get busy with that. They want them to go speak about the climate, go speak about abortion, go kill yourselves, go do that." What is the fundamentalist and jihadi agenda for the West? The future of the West, quote, "has to be Muslim," this Muslim man said. "This is the correct religion. This is the religion that all of humanity needs to be a part of Islam, and we will not stop until it enters every home." End quote. October 7th further emboldened these sentiments and gave rise to anti-Western Muslims who live in the West and their extremist progressive friends, all of whom are more interested in burning down the West than in, for instance, promoting decent policies. In San Francisco a few days ago, for example, quote-unquote, pro-Palestinian activists marched through the streets and spray-painted "Death to Israel and the U.S. of America" on nearby stores. Yet most reasonable people, because they are reasonable, cannot believe that the goal of the far left is to end the West. What's more, we have seen the escalation of activist messaging go from relatively reasonable criticism about Israel to both implicit and explicit calls for the complete annihilation of the Jewish state. Incitement, violent rhetoric, and rallying for attacks on Jews are not just coming from the far right, as they historically have. They are now the bread and butter of the far left, the progressive extremists. According to these leftists' calculus, when 44,000-plus terror attacks are committed in nearly 70 countries since 9/11, exclusively by Islamic extremists, not a single Muslim is to blame. In fact, some progressive extremist organizations are now trying to promote the narrative that the word terrorist is a, quote, racial slur. But when Israel retaliates against Hamas in Gaza and in doing so, regrettably kills innocent people, all Jews across the world are to blame. As such, London is now the most anti-Semitic metropolis in the West. Heck, the environment there is not only hostile towards Jews, but also towards the British. When even Big Ben and a statue of Winston Churchill are not out of bounds, nobody can feel safe. And San Francisco, Paris, Amsterdam, New York City, Johannesburg, Sydney, Toronto, and Chicago are not far behind. To add insult to injury, internet companies, such as Facebook, Instagram, Google, TikTok, and OpenAI, which have the largest, most immediately accessible audiences, are increasingly run by far-left folks who habitually inject their treacherous identity politics and dogmas into these products. The internet does not live in a silo, of course. It drives people into Western streets who are, quote, literally tripping over themselves in their eagerness to demonstrate that they cannot distinguish between those who intentionally kill babies and those who inadvertently kill them, having taken great pains to avoid killing them, while defending themselves against the very people who have just intentionally tortured and killed innocent men, women, and yes, babies, as philosopher and neuroscientist Sam Harris described it. Whether you're an anti-Semite or just an apologist for atrocity is probably immaterial, added Harris. The crucial point is that you are dangerously confused about the moral norms and political sympathies that make life in this world worth living. These progressive extremists then elect officials in the West, which pretend that they have a clue about deeply complex, historical geopolitical issues, like the Israel-Hamas war. They make absurd, completely irrelevant statements and cute, nicely worded social media posts that effectively encourage their constituents to continue their pursuit of burning down the West. This sociological pathology is now pervasive, contributing to the soft bigotry of low expectations that forms part of modern identity politics in the West. And as foreign policy becomes increasingly conflated with the culture wars, this pathology has now expanded beyond the West's borders to places like Israel and Gaza. The result is that the application of progressive moral double standards is becoming a key decision-making factor in international politics, including but not limited to the West's handling of this Israel-Hamas war. We have produced a dialogue in which deviancy is grossly limited for Jews and Israel, and extraordinarily expansive for Arabs and Muslims. It should be noted that having sympathy for the Palestinians does not necessarily indicate that you are a progressive extremist, so long as you also have genuine sympathy for Israelis, Jews, and other groups of people who are also experiencing suffering around the world. Just like agreeing with aspects of communism during the Cold War should not have meant that you were automatically a Soviet spy sympathizing with the mostly Palestinian-inflicted plight of the Palestinian people should not immediately imply that you are a terrorist sympathizer and hateful bigot of the West. But if you are exclusively or overly focused on the Palestinians, and if you predominantly blame Israel, that is the Jews, for the plight of the Palestinian people, then yes, you might be a progressive extremist. And if you are a progressive extremist, then you are an enemy of democracy and democratic values, no different than the far-right variations.